Hi everyone, and welcome to this sort of end of a long school day session on the 12-mark visual analysis paper. This is the one that most people seem to get come unstuck on, and so Pearson thought it would be very useful to have kind of an insider's view on that, and our view of the mark scheme and how it's applied and how students can get the most out of it. A little word of warning before we start, that if there are any students watching, the examples are from this year's exam, and that could mean that if you were using these examples in your mock exams, that students will have had a look at it. So if there are any students here, you might want to shuffle them out of the room, and then we can get on with the welcome. Now, the very able Benedict is being my slide mover today. It's a bit like COVID times. And oh, thanks, Benedict. Look, he's read my mind and gone on to the first slide, which is brilliant. So we're going to look at individual responses. We're going to look at candidate responses. What we aren't going to do is discuss particular marks for these, but we have some high-level responses and some low-level responses. And there will be time for questions. I'll take hands up at the end of each section and then some more at the end. So next slide, please, Benedict. So we're going to talk through the 2024 painting question. We're going to talk through the sculpture question and then the architecture question, probably about 15 minutes on each one. If you've got the question paper on you, you can probably see a high quality image. It should be okay on the screen. So we're going to give you some top tips. We're going to look at how to avoid some of the pitfalls that students commonly fall into. And we are using examples from actual scripts, no names, no pack drill, but you might recognise some of the typical answers. These aren't exceptional answers, these are typical of how students answer this question. So next slide, please, Benedict. And we can flick through this one and to the next slide, and we'll just go through a few hints and tips. A lot of this is kind of me teaching my grandma to suck eggs, but it's worth going through these things and stating the bleeding obvious, really. Places where students go wrong are most commonly identified here. So candidates need to answer the question that has been asked in response to the specific images in front of them. Every year, we get students who see an image and think, oh, this question is something similar to what I did very well in my mock, and therefore I will answer that question rather than answer this question. And we get candidates who write fantastic answers, but they are not actually answering the question. So that is very exasperating. There are no AO1 marks. So that is something to be held front and centre, I think. There are no A1 marks available for these questions for the whole paper. There are no AO1 marks. Therefore, candidates cannot be rewarded for previous knowledge. If they apply what they know about that knowledge to a work, then that's different. But they have no marks available. There's no way we can reward previous knowledge of style or context. AO2 marks. And this is worth bearing in mind because I'll be talking about AO2 and AO3 interchangeably quite a lot when we talk about the work. So just a note that AO2 are awarded for analysis and interpretation. Okay, analysis and interpretation. Not just for pure description. And they're also awarded for understanding of visual language, not for learnt terminology. So we apply the so what test to what's written. So if a student goes into great detail about all the Gothic characteristics of a building, but doesn't analyse or interpret or bring any meaning from that learned terminology, if you were standing in front of that building and they said, oh yes, there's a pointed arch and there's this and there's that, and you say, and, or there's a string course, and how is that visually affecting the interpretation of the building? As a good teacher, you'll be saying yes and, or so what, and that has to be the way that it's marked. So reeling off a lot of terminology on its own is not enough. You can reel off a lot and apply it, but just knowing, being lucky enough to know lots of Gothic terminology is not going to give a student a good mark. AO3 is for the development of analysis and interpretation to make a critical judgment. So really important, the critical judgment there, and we'll see that when we look at some of the work. Some candidates, and we've found this increasingly, there's a strategy to leave this section of the paper until last and rush through them at the end. This section of the paper is worth 36 marks. So it needs to be treated seriously. Quite often when markers come to section 3, the architecture section, a lot of students have noticeably run out of time. So it may be worth looking at timing if that happens with your students, and this is the strategy that you employ with them, answering this little bit first. So worth thinking about. Right, Benedict, next one, please. Okay, just to look at the discuss and consider marks. This requires analysis and interpretation of relevant aspects of the issue, element, situation, problem, concept, or argument. So discuss, consider. Those words are in the spec with very specific parameters for those. The answers will apply critical judgment to formulate a reasoned argument and use subject-specific language and evidence to support points. It's the evidence to support points that often candidates slip on, and sometimes this really separates out a model answer from a mid-range answer. Right, let's have a look at the first example, the painting section. Next slide, please, Benedict, to the painting. So from this year's in particular, these were the main pitfalls that we found that prevented students getting a better mark. So we are discussing the figure and the setting of this portrait. That's the first part. And we're considering the artist's depiction of texture, pattern, and ornamentation. So discuss the figure and setting. Some students just talked about the figure and the setting was secondary, and some talked about the setting and the figure was quite lightly sketched over. 50-50 is always good for figure and setting. So several candidates focused too much on the status of the woman. Okay, we'd had status as a previous question related to portraiture, and some students took that and thought, aha, a portrait, and went into far too much detail, far too much supposition about the figure. Candidates who answer the question they wish had been asked cannot access all the marks available. That's fairly blunt, isn't it? Supposition regarding who the woman is, what she does, the role of women at the time cannot be credited. There are no AO1 marks available, remember, for pre-learned knowledge or contextual knowledge. So candidates are encouraged to focus their responses fully on what can be seen from the image. This is the difference in this paper. They are looking for evidence only within the confines of what they are given. So a lot of students also wrote about colour, and again they kind of pulled in stuff that they were confident about from previous questions in the past. So while colour can be discussed, and sometimes it was successfully discussed, it has to be linked to its role in the figure and the setting, and with reference to the texture, pattern and ornamentation. So quite a few people talked about the texture in the application of paint within texture. We did have a few people strangely talk about the little box on the black thing as being a socket on a black skirting board, which was quite funny. They won't get marked down for that, but the answer needs to stay focused on the figure and the setting. About 50-50 figure and setting, and then 50-50 for the first part and the second part of the question. Lots of nice answers when they went into detail about texture, pattern and ornamentation, and how that contrasted to the figure, the flattening of pictorial space with the modelling of the hands and the face. So as long as they stuck to what they could see, we had quite a lot of high level answers, and we'll have a look at one. So Benedict, if you can skip through the next slide. So this is a top level. I don't have the marks for this. I didn't mark this. But if you still have the image in front of you, here is an actual answer, and I'm going to leave you to just have a little read through it for 5 minutes. Anything that is typed in black does not gain any marks at all, except if it is then backed up with something, because everything in black is really pure description. So the painting depicts a woman. She has a rosy flush to her cheeks. Used to paint the figure, thin washes of paint. A red wall behind her, decorated with small blue squares, head at the apex. Anything like that is pure description, and if your student was stood in front of this painting and you said, right, tell me about this, and you said, she's got rosy, and they said she's got rosy cheeks, there's a red wall with blue squares, and her head is at the apex, you would say, okay, and why, and what? Tell me more. What does that mean? How do you interpret that? Give me some analysis of what that means. And down the side, you can see that each section really relates to the colour. So when I did this presentation live, there was a question about which is better, to answer the whole of the first part of the question first, and then the whole of the second part in another section, or to make creative links and let it flow as the student wants. I think the teacher was concerned that examiners would miss things if they mixed both parts of the question. The training for that is really, really rigorous. There is no method that will gain extra marks or lose marks. The examiners will pick out each point and mark it, no matter which section it comes from. I would say I found it much easier to teach students to be methodical and look for all the points for the first part and then all the points for the second part. They can then see visually if they're writing about the same amount, and see which bit is stronger and which bit they might add to. So if that works for my students, you might have a different way of doing it. It really doesn't matter. The examiners are trained to pick out every single little bit, so don't worry about that. So that is a high scoring answer, a top level response. Let's look at the second part, Benedict, please. Next slide. Benedict, can we have the next slide, please? Oh yeah, there it is. Thank you. So texture and pattern are very considered in this work, as is ornamentation. This is a high level response as well. Anything in black, again, will not be credited, gives no credit. We are looking again on the interpretation, and there is a lot of perceptive analysis in this. So if you want to have a little read through. The understanding of visual language. This is a student who knows what they're talking about and evidences and their points. They are specific, and this is an important point. It's very easy to make a general point. The examiner has to be convinced by the specificity of the sorry, I think somebody's making a point and I want to have a look at that in the chat. Pointing out that the blue and orange are complementary is not rewarded. So why? So yes, it's pointed out that it's that it makes this stand out, but again, that's vague. And what is standing out? What is the why would you want it to stand out? Does it stand out in order to create a sense of depth? So we really want to know. You know, if the students stand in front of it and they spot a complementary colour combination, great. And also say, well, it makes it stand out. What stands out, and why would the artist do that? if they think about spatial depth, it might they would mention that in a high level answer. That's just a little bit vague for a high level answer. And Phoebe, please can I clarify something? Is it best to suggest to students that they write equally on both parts of the question? The marks are divided equally between the two, so I would advise them to do that. I advise my students to do so. Obviously, there's always timing pressure with this section, and the second part can be slightly more time consuming. Some of my students prefer this part of the question because they get a bit thrown by what they can say in the first part. But yeah, we generally advise that both parts should have pretty much the same number of points. Hope that's okay. So sometimes interpretation can include critical judgment in the same sentence. How are the areas awarded in this instance, please? Both assessment objectives would be awarded if it's in the same sentence. We are looking always to award. So whether it's in the same sentence or whether a student makes 2 sentences out of it, we will pick up on the point as long as it's specific. With previous figure setting, I noticed there's little analysis of pose. I get my students to spend more time analysing pose. The G hands together. Demure, is that not important? We need to go back to the previous slide really, so I can see this work. Notes. I think it can be mentioned. We had quite a lot of students talking about the hands looked fidgety. If that was linked, I think it's important because that is an interpretation of the figure. I think where it got out of hand was when they talked about the hands being slightly animated or slightly in repose, and then it started to go into how troubled she looked or how she looked nervous, or we had students write pretty much a whole mental health report about this poor woman. So I think that a comment on the figure and the setting, talking about the hands and the expression on her face is okay. It's good and it would be awarded. But going into a lot of supposition is where students tend to fall down on this one. Okay, hope that's okay. So we are going to have to move on, please, Benedict, just to the summary. Okay, so for this response in particular, no supposition, no speculation, no superfluous information. Discussion is fully focused on the question, and it's evidenced through specific details within the work. The candidate discusses the figure and setting in a sophisticated manner, interesting comparisons between the two, and evidencing all the assertions with specific details found in the work. Texture, pattern, ornamentation are also considered in a detailed manner in relation to all elements of the work. So they look at every part of the figure and setting, but they also look at every aspect they can of texture, pattern, and ornamentation on both the figure and the setting. The response is carefully structured to ensure equal coverage of both parts of the question. So it is possible to reach the top level of mark scheme without such a clear division. It shows a focus on the question and comprehensive response to both parts. therefore that kind of backs up what I said before, that ideally a 50-50 split, and if your answer is structured into one section and the other section, it does help the students build up a kind of a methodology for answering this question. Your more capable students are going to be able to write a more organic answer that flows. They won't be penalised, but they do have to guard against becoming too flowery and going off on a tangent. Okay, so I think we can probably move on to the sculpture and have a little look at that one. So when we looked at this, we thought this was a shoe-in for a good answer, I have to say. Bronze always elicits strong answers, but there were some pitfalls. So a lot of very descriptive answers with very little analysis about form and composition. So an awful lot of, here's the figure, contrapposto, hand in the air, sword, head held high, that kind of stuff. We weren't fazed by an incorrect reading of the figure at the bottom. They aren't supposed to know that that's Medusa. So lack of knowledge, again, no AO1. It's all about interpretation. And if the interpretation is strong, if it's an incorrect interpretation, then they won't penalise. They're not penalised for that. Let's have a look at the pitfalls. So some responses were descriptive. Many candidates were surprisingly weak in their analysis of how the process of bronze casting impacts the appearance of the work. We had a lot of very long description about the lost wax process. The lost wax process, that's AO1, that's just pure learned knowledge. If they want to gain from writing that, then probably, a very short description, but directly linked to a specific element visible in the sculpture. So the lettering on the band across the chest, the level of detail in that, and linking that to how the lost wax process allows for that level of detail. The entrails falling from the head, or the raised arm, and the high tensile strength and the quality of the material. We need really for them to give us the quality of the material, the high tensile strength, but then tell me exactly where they are looking to prove that bronze has high tensile strength. We're looking to award for making those connections, but we can't award if there's only AO1 coming out, because we have no means on the mark scheme to give AO1. The high tensile strength was mentioned a lot. Many didn't reference whereabouts in the work. Some candidates mistook the process as an additive process. They talked about carving bronze rather than etching, carving into the wax in the process. So by giving all of that detail, sometimes they showed a lack of understanding of the material and the technique. And I think sometimes they went into a lot of detail about the lost wax process that was learned just to fill up some lines. And it's a shame really, because they lost some time over that. Let's have a look. Were both responses copied in full? First one ends in the middle of sentence. Is this how it ended? If not, great to have whole example. I think the whole example was on there. Forgive me. It may well be that the bottom of the slide's not showing, I'm not sure. So description is fine as long as it's linked to the use of the materials. So yes, absolutely. You know, as long as there has to be some description, you have to describe the work, but just describing it is going to lead to a "and so what" moment. So yes, description is allowed, but empty description can't be awarded. Okay, so shall we have a look at an answer that is probably not so great, shall we say? This is an actual answer. And from the lower attaining mark bands, this is very typical answer that examiners see. Able to see there how, from an examiner's point of view and from the mark scheme's point of view, how little there is given that marks can be given for. So, you know, we don't want to know if it was rediscovered through ancient texts. That's pre-learned knowledge. It's a shame that the student kind of missed out on a mark because they were aware that they could use the process of modelling to create intricate details, but the student just wrote "found throughout the sculpture." Well, that's easy to say. Whereabouts was it found? Students that gave examples, specific examples, were the ones that gained the marks for that. It's very frustrating to read these because sometimes the student has got the idea but just hasn't been specific enough. And again, the blue bit is just purely descriptive. It's pre-learned information, it's not applied. And you can see how that really can't be awarded when we're asking for interpretation of a specific sculpture. Okay, so that's a what not to do. Shall we have a look at a nice one, please, Benedict? Thank you. Let's have a look at a top level response. Okay, so this is the first part, form, composition. So I think, as someone said, that there is description here. Inevitably, description is in there, but that description is then linked all the time to form and composition. It comes back to the question time and time again. Form and composition. So I'm hoping that you're starting to see that for a top level answer, we're looking at perceptive Words such as perceptive, words such as excellent, in-depth, reasoned argument. And it doesn't have to be highfalutin. Sometimes students, complicated, shall we say, language hides a very vague point that they make, and examiners do see through that. We need some precision. So I'm looking at some of the points. I think I would agree that maybe that first part, Lisa, should be black, because his right hand grips onto a sword pointed towards the viewer, is the point, and his left hand holds up the dead head of the victim he's just killed, would be AO1. But there is some, I mean, this is obviously somebody who knows the myth and knows about Perseus, but so I kind of agree that maybe that should be AO1, but we also get the in-depth, the reasoned argument and the evidence. It's specific because this person then goes on to say, underlining both his success and impressive identity as a warrior. To clarify, that line about echoing and totems, surely evaluation was that not marked just because it is unintelligible? Let me have a look at that bit. Echoing and evaluation was that not marked just because it is unintelligible? Echo the totemic line created by the composition. I think that the fact that the mark is within the bit of the elevation and the link with stature, it's difficult really to justify the totemic line, you know, because his arm's in the air. That's more literally about appearance, I think, as in the form of a totem rather than it being totemic and symbolic in that way. I hope that makes sense. Totemic as in tall and thin like a totem pole, then it's kind of descriptive, and if it's totemic in the true sense, it probably doesn't apply to this sculpture, and it may be that it was seen as being AO1 knowledge. Okay, I hope that's clear. Can we go to the second part of the question, please? So consider how the sculptor has made use of the material and technique. So when we're marking this, we'll acknowledge the fact that this student knows about the lost wax process, and there is meticulous detail. But what we want to know is where this meticulous detail is. Okay, so there is evidence then in the blue bit. This can be seen in the strength and definition of his veins. So that's where the mark's awarded, not for the first part of the sentence there. And again, the next sentence after that is a very good point, but it is not evidenced. Imogen, I think you asked something about defining form. There is in the guidance a whole list of definitions for words that are used. I haven't got that on me at the moment, but I advise you to go and have a look there. I think it's in there. Would you credit the high level of finish shining to draw the eye? I think that we credited, I haven't got the mark scheme in front of me, but I think we credited the light reflecting qualities of bronze, the patina. I think we didn't necessarily say to draw the eye. I mean, what are we drawing the eye to? Just the general sculpture? Because anything shiny draws the eye for a top level response. We're kind of using, we want specifics. So the surface as a general point, probably not credited, but if it's has a specific quality, maybe it draws the eye to the muscle definition, something like that. Wording of the question is always taken from the spec box. So for painting spec 0.1D, manipulation of form of sculpture, the words are composition, colour, line, scale, etc. Jamie, that sounds like a very detailed question, and I'm going to run out of time. It may well be that that's one to refer to the expert team. I don't recall ever seeing any indicative content emphasis chasing as a component of bronze working. It's relevant, especially when discussing surface refinement. It may well be that it's relevant here. It's one of the processes chasing in producing bronze that we would kind of expect knowledge of in a high level answer. Okay, I think that's everything from that one, and we really need to move on to the summary of this response before we move on to the final thing, so I can stay in time for you all. Okay, again, there is careful analysis and interpretation of the work. You would be impressed with this student, I think, if they were producing answers like this for you regularly. Again, the discussion is fully focused on the question. If your students just need to sit for a minute and work out what is being asked. It's largely well evidenced, and that evidence is it's very sophisticated for a student at this level. Excellent analysis and understanding of the figures. So there is strong knowledge of the material and techniques. But they relate it to the specific details within the work. If I was to say to you, take 1 point away from this to increase your students' performance, it will be always evidence their points within a specific part of the work. I think more students will gain more marks from that than anything else. Again, the response is carefully structured, equal coverage of both parts of the question. That on the main at this age, it's the clearest way to advise your students to answer a question. Okay, right, let's go to the third piece of work, the architecture. And the next slide. Okay. So we had a lot of people write about religious purpose, a lot of learnt information from previous exam questions, a lot of long lists of architectural features that had been learned and recognised as Gothic, instead of focusing on a consideration of the importance through the architectural features. I think I've talked really a fair bit about, I haven't got anything against Gothic, it just seems to be the thing that students learn a lot of and then don't apply. So quite a lot of terminology was actually used incorrectly and features were incorrectly identified. And some students were using classical language. So if they are going to use specialist language, which really they should be using the correct language. So they're the pitfalls. If you want to have a look at the next slide, this will have a response that isn't ideal on it. So all of the red, no credit. Okay, we also don't spend too long on this. I want to towards the positives, but you can see here now the obvious weaknesses and maybe how the student could have spent a lot of time when they were writing for writing's sake, spending much more time on specifics. Okay, let's move to a nice answer. So top level of the mark scheme, discuss the design and composition. Again, I have no problem with students using the system. You know, the main part of the facade is articulated ABA. And it may be that the two enormous doors to allow a large number of people to enter and leave the building could then be pushed to answer the second part of the question a little more. So where Gothic terminology is used, it's used correctly. So talking about students struggling to know why they need to know all the fancy words. Yeah, I've had this argument. They're learning a language. And within that language, there are technical terms, and those technical terms carry meaning. Those technical terms carry meaning, and it will help them. So if they know about a gable, then they will know about the visual impact of having a gable. They will know how to look for things such as creating balance. They will need to look at features that, a pointed arch creates more of a sense of verticality. Things like that at its most basic. But if you are teaching about the features and the ways that they can help in when you're interpreting those features, if they learn those at the same time, showing them a range of arches and saying which ones of these is more powerful because it's pointing upwards. Start them off slow and work your way up, really. So I think teaching labeling diagrams it is a way to teach it, but sometimes it's quite limited. That they need to be learning not just the vocabulary, but also the meaning at the same time, I think. Yes, ABA is composition. That's okay, because you are saying it's ABA. However, so what? We're having the so what moment again. Does it provide, a sense of stability because there's some symmetry? Is it balanced? I think for a top level answer, just saying ABA is not enough. We want that to have some analysis to it. So just very top level of the mark scheme just needs to tick all the boxes. Okay. The problem with saying I thought ABA speaks for itself is that we're not allowed as markers to assume knowledge. It has to be backed up with something else. So we're not allowed to let anything speak for itself. Everything has to be evidenced, analysed, or interpreted. Otherwise, we would be able to mark description, pure description. Yeah, 3-part facade with protruding structure visible on the right-hand side, ABA pattern where ABAs are not identical. But that also has to that is the description. That's the correct description, but it needs to be justified in some way. And obviously, every single interpretation of that can't be written on the mark scheme. So the fact that it is mentioned will draw the attention of the examiner, but it needs analysis for credit. Okay, I'm conscious of the time. So let's move to the next slide, please, Benedict. Okay, so this is really quite a strong answer. We're impressed with this. At first sight, it does seem like quite a short answer, but in the first part of the question, the student had 2 points picked out and marked for this section. So the examiner was quite astute here and very detailed in picking that stuff out. So some really, really obvious stuff that students often forget is scale and height, and things like where the building is set. So it's set in a large area, it's on its own. Levels of skill. You know, we don't. The fact that they knew that the word stonemasons for making the building is AO1, but it's woven right into highly skilled, knowledgeable, and expensive. So there are no wasted words in this answer. There's no waffle. Everything is targeted. Every sentence adds to the student's mark. We really like this one. Elliot, your answer there, yes, it would be AO1. That's pre-learned knowledge, but if you would say, rather than say this is this, if you would say that this, the group above the portal is could be used to instruct the faithful, I think that leaves it open because it could also be the donors of the, you know, so there is some supposition there. I have no problem with them noticing that and giving me a possible thing, but to say that this is something is going to attract the AO1 danger, I think. Yes, Lisa, I agree. This is why we're here really talking about this, because visual analysis is the hardest to gain marks from and is very often underrated in favour of longer form answers. Students have to be able to understand and talk the language of art, and yeah, it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one. Right, guys, let's have a summary of response slide, please, because we're right in the last minute. So it deals well with both parts of the question. That it is systematic. It works its way through. Features considered in relation to each other rather than in isolation. Comparative language above leading to between, taller and narrower. This shows strong engagement with specific features of the building, and the consideration of how the architectural features express importance is impressive. It is impressive. I think you'd be, like I said before, very impressed with a candidate that gets all of these things right. We have kind of run out of time. I hope that I've been able to answer your questions as we've gone along. This is kind of what happened when we did this at the Tate. So I think we'll move through the final 3 slides just to the subject advisor support. Your subject advisor for your area. Now there is a link on the slideshow and I can't click on it. So my advice would be download the slideshow, click on the link, and you will get to your advisor details. And if you want more training courses, this is the next slide, Benedict, please, then you can climb a mountain and go, hooray! And there is a Professional Development Academy. The link is on there. Thank you for your time. I hope that's been useful. And I really, really would say to you that if you want any more advice, to contact the subject advisors, because they are absolutely brilliant. But thank you very much. Oh, I can't give you the marks. I don't know them. I've not been told them. All I know is that they are top mark band or lower mark band. Maybe you could give one to your students and give them the mark scheme and ask them to mark it. I always find that's quite a useful example exercise and quite eye-opening for them, because sometimes they think that a lot of information is markable and it really isn't. So best of luck in the summer. Okay, goodbye.